I'm going to talk fast. All right, so it's clear that people moralize purity concerns. They're concerned about the sanctity of their body, about sex, about religion. One need only look to the Bible to recognize that purity concerns have been with us a very long time. More recently, More recently, it's been shown that people moralize purity violations such as gay marriage, consensual incest, and burning the Bible, sacrilege. But the question is why? Why do people moralize these concerns? One explanation, as Jeremy suggested, is harm. People see these violations as harmful, and that's why they see them as immoral. But these seem objectively harmless. And so the logic goes, there must be another mechanism leading to their moral condemnation, a separate module, a purity mechanism. But are these acts really harmless? Well, that depends on your definition of harm. So historically speaking, Turiel Kohlberg and even John have suggested that harm is this objective, reason, kind of obvious physical suffering. Even the scenarios that Jeremy used, it's really about pain, right? If something's about harm, it's about something bleeding, like a mountain. Right? It seems unlikely, and that's why we have a different perspective. And that our view is that harm is really a matter of perception. It's intuitive, right? And it varies across culture. So in contrast to what Jeremy suggested about us having a monist account, it's actually a pluralist account as well, but a different pluralistic account. And this is not such a crazy idea that harm follows this kind of perceived, intuitive sense, because this is exactly what we've been arguing morality has been like for the past 2 decades. Right? John's been suggesting it's intuitive, it's perceived, and I'm just suggesting that the same is true of harm. That's all. And so this means you can cause harm to the soul and to society, and this is just semantic, right? Because these senses of harm lead to more direct harm. So if the soul suffers, you go to hell, right? As Christians believe this, and if society suffers, right, it leads eventually to violence. And so this provides a new understanding of moral pluralism. So Rick Schwader provides an account of a Brahmin Indian who's judged as immoral because he eats chicken after his father's funeral. Now to us in the West, us liberals, this seems pretty harmless, and so we assume it must be about purity. But in fact, to Brahmin Indians, right, to anthropologists, this is really about harm. Because Brahmin Indians perceive that eating chicken after your father's funeral stops the processing of death pollution and thereby condemns your father's soul to eternal suffering. Now, this idea of harm is instantiated in the theory of dyadic morality, which suggests that we have an innately prepared prototype or template through which we view the moral world. And this template is built up over the most salient, typical, and important moral acts that surround us, things like theft and stealing and murder. And it consists of 3 general parts: intention, causation, and suffering. It's a kind of constructed template. Together, this is what I mean by harm. Not a mountain bleeding, but this kind of general confluence of intention and causation and suffering, interpersonal harm. And these things are innate, I say, because theory of mind, causation, and empathy are all relatively innate. Importantly, these are also shaped by cultural learning. Different cultures have different ideas about who can suffer and how they may suffer. And so this flexibility in perceived innocence and patience allows for moral pluralism. You can cause immorality not only by things like murder, but also by acts of impurity. And you can cause suffering not only to living people, but also to spirits, to society, and to souls. I think the way to think about it is something like origami. Right? So it's clear that origami has a rich diversity of different shapes. No one would ever say that these are the same thing, but they're all made of the ultimate same substrate. And so does with morality as well. All the moral world is made up of perceived harm, but it takes on different transformations depending on the context. Nevertheless, it offers a clear prediction about what should be seen as more or less harmful, and that is perceived harm, what should be seen as more or less immoral. So in one paper with Chelsea Shine, we asked people to judge as quickly as possible if an act was immoral and if it was harmful, predicting, of course, that these things should be correlated. They are very highly correlated, about 0.8, even when we control for things like general negativity. And what you find is that the canonically harmful acts are seen to be most immoral, and then the less harmful acts are seen to be less immoral. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that things like disrespect and gossip aren't immoral, just that they're less immoral. Right? So the diet provides a continuum of morality based upon harm rather than discrete lines. And of course, I would acknowledge that in the US we emphasize physical harm, and that in other cultures, right, other forms of harm may be more or less related. Moral foundations theory offers a competing prediction. It's the idea that there's a set of innately prepared modules or mechanisms corresponding to various kinds of moral content. Now, the question of module is a contentious question. And so there's strong versus weak modularity. And so recently, John, Jesse, and Pete have suggested that NFT employs only the weak notion of modularity, such that the moral mind is partially structured in advance, and that NFT just provides a first draft of the moral mind. This is an intuitive idea, but I think ultimately it's very difficult to falsify. It's hard to imagine designing an experiment that can rule out a kind of first draft of the moral mind. However, John and Jesse have provided some nice claims that they suggest, if falsified, would also falsify moral foundations theory. And these claims are innateness, cultural development, intuitionism, and pluralism. Unfortunately, these claims are non-specific. Right? So there's no theory I can think of in moral psychology or elsewhere that argues against the interaction of nature versus nurture. I think we can all agree that that's true. Intuition and pluralism also fail to distinguish moral foundations theory from other theories, including dyadic morality. Dyadic morality suggests that harm is intuitive. It acknowledges that harm varies across cultures. And so these claims don't really have the possibility to disconfirm or confirm moral foundations theory. These claims of weak modularity also directly contradicts claims of strong modularity. So they've written that MFT is near the maximalist side of the modularity spectrum, which suggests that purity is separate from harm, involves special cognitive processes from harm, and is linked specifically to one emotion, namely disgust. It's supported by quotes like this: distinct systems that subserve different types of moral judgment and specific emotional and motivational reactions. I think the easiest quote to understand is John's quote that moral foundations are universal cognitive modules, which are little switches in the brain of all animals. Right? It really gives this idea that there's separate circuits, each corresponding to specific moral content. And whether John advocates that idea today, I think it's clear that those of us in moral psychology understand moral foundations theory in this way, as a set of mechanisms or modules. So, there's competing predictions now. MFT suggests that purity is distinct and special. Dyadic morality suggests that it is not. Let's look at the first one. Is purity separate from harm? To get at this, we stack the deck against us and use moral foundation scenarios. So we ask people to read about MFT harm scenarios, like killing an endangered species, MFT purity scenarios, like getting a surgically enhanced tail, and we had them rate MFT dictionary words applying to each of these scenarios. And what we found is, in fact, that ratings of harm and purity are correlated 0.9. And if you control for attenuation, it's 1. Even more importantly, harm scenarios were actually rated as more impure than impurity scenarios, right? Representing a basic manipulation benefit. So really, when people are talking about impurity, they seem to be pointing to harm. And this is a paper with Jonathan Keating. And so you might argue maybe this perceived harm is just reasoned rationalization. Well, we have a study that looked at that. We asked people to judge the perception of victims, so this is actually like victims rather than a vague semantic harm, whether they were under time pressure or had ample time to reason. Now, what we found is when they read harm scenarios, they saw lots of victims, whether they reasoned or not. But when we gave them purity scenarios, they saw some harm, obviously less than harm scenarios because they're not economically harmful. But the important thing is that they saw more harm when they didn't have time to reason. Right? So reasoning, if anything, damped down harm, and what initially they saw, intuitively they saw, is harm. So it appears that purity is not separate from harm. What about specific cognitive processes, distinct subsystems? Well, the way this has been looked at in the literature is by using scenarios like having sex with a chicken and then eating it, and other scenarios like causing murder. It's been found that purity scenarios are excused less when they're done accidentally, and that purity is more linked to judgments of character versus act. But there's a big difference between these scenarios, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of atypicality or weirdness. Right? It's hard to imagine accidentally having sex with a chicken, and so perhaps that's why these things happen. And so Jonathan Keating and I designed a new set of purity scenarios, crowdsourced, so we asked participants to volunteer impure acts. And what we found is when we controlled for atypicality with these scenarios like pornography and prostitution, all these cognitive differences disappeared. Now, it's important to note that this isn't just a rare occurrence of this one paper suggesting these weird scenarios. The majority of work in the field looking at harm and purity uses these bizarre scenarios. And they've been cited over 4,000 times. So it seems that much of our field is based upon these bizarre scenarios. Second, or third, is purity specially linked to disgust. So moral foundations theory predicts so. We hypothesize specific linkages between sanctity, divinity, purity, and disgust. This could be a whole other talk, but what we did, by we I mean Daryl Cameron, Kristen Lindquist, and I, but mostly Daryl Cameron, looked at the entire literature, suggesting links between discrete moral content and specific emotions, And as we conclude in PSPR, we found no evidence for specific links between moral content and discrete emotions. So that's the entire literature. And the reason it seems like there is this link is because these studies used insufficient experimental controls. They confounded purity and disgust with things like valence, arousal, and conceptual content. Moral foundation theory makes an additional prediction, and that is that disgust drives moral condemnation of purity violations, which are later put by harm-based rationalizations. So the quote from John's paper. And so we wanted to test this with a kind of causal attempt, with a kind of mediation study. And so we used these kind of ostensibly harmless scenarios, and we asked people to rate their harmfulness, their wrongness, and their disgust. And I should say, this data I just got accepted a week ago at Emotion. And what we found was that when you control, well, first harm or disgust is mediated through harm, and that has an impact on morality. But when you control for perceived harm, right, not believing, but kind of perceptions of harm in the kind of broadly pluralistic sense, the influence of disgust on immorality disappears. So disgust influences immorality through harm. All right. And of course this has to be the case, right? If you're a parent, there's lots of things that are incredibly disgusting that aren't immoral. You're dealing with the dirty diaper, right? That's not an immoral thing. What distinguishes disgusting, immoral things from disgusting, non-immoral things is really the perception of harm. All right. So it seems then that purity is a useful descriptive label. It's something that names things in the world, and it doesn't apply to a specific mechanism that explains it. And there's a big difference between naming something and explaining it. And of course, I agree that a name can highlight important diversity. So with animals, we can all agree that they're all made of DNA in an ultimate sense, but I'd never go to the San Diego Zoo and say, there's a DNA, there's a DNA, there's a DNA, right? Clearly there are differences, and those are important differences, right? And so what I suggest is that purity could be important for naming these things, but it's not clear to me that this idea has construct validity. Right, this is a psychological question. Does this idea of purity have construct validity? And you can assess it with divergent validity. So purity should be separate from other constructs. Right? You can do the multi-method, multi-trait matrix. Is purity separate from these other constructs? And to examine this, I look primarily at John and Jesse's data. So this paper is mine. It suggests that purity and perceived harm, again, are correlated about at 0.9. Purity and authority are correlated about 0.8. That's actually purity and authority are correlated more highly than purity items are correlated with themselves. Purity and conservatism are correlated at 0.7, and if you control for the relatively unreliability, low retest reliability of the purity MFQ, this correlation is close to 1. And so this provides a new perspective on this figure that's often used in moral foundations research. So there's a reason that purity and authority go so well together. It's really that they're the same thing. And there's a reason that purity is monotonically related to conservatism. Because it is conservatism, right? We'd expect it to be a perfect relation because it's a reframing of conservatism. Purity and religiosity are highly correlated, and purity and atypicality. So Clifford et al. Recently had a set of standardized moral foundation scenarios published. They're standardized on things like word length, so they're about the same length. Here's an authority scenario. A man watches his cell phone in church. Here's a purity scenario. A woman has sex with her dead dad. These are very different, right? Not just because of moral content, but because they are different. We can all agree intuitively that they are just different. And it's important to recognize that these differences. So I know Jesse just had a paper come out looking at how purity binds people together, and Jeremy talked a little bit about that too. And I think it binds people together in some ways because religion binds people together. Jesse and John have a great paper in PSPR showing that religion really binds people together, right? But it's not clear to me that purity is doing anything here. Because in the Twitter analysis, they don't control for religiosity, and in the experimental studies, they use these bizarre scenarios from Clifford et al. So in conclusion, I agree that purity is a compelling intuitive moral term, but there's no evidence for strongly modular foundation of distinct modules or mechanisms. The weaker modular account of a first draft of the moral mind is nonspecific, vague, and I think it's frankly contradictory. This descriptive label, while could a possible use, has questionable construct validity, even if it is intuitive and rooted in history. And I think what purity really is grounded in perceived harm. And I think you can just ask conservatives. Right? We published an op-ed recently about gay marriage being about harm, and we got a lot of emails from conservatives saying, thank you, finally. Right? Liberals always think it's about purity, but it's actually about perceived harm. And so I think there is some synthesis, however, between dyadic morality and moral foundations theory. I think what moral foundation theory presents is a very elegant taxonomy of perceived harm. Again, with origami, right, it doesn't make any sense to go around the world and just say that here's harm, 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 but instead it makes sense to say, what are the manifestations of harm? What are the intermediates of those harm? And I think that's what MFT does very nicely. And I think what the dyad does acknowledge is the richness of cultural pluralism, right? Not monism, the dyad is cultural pluralism, but within a parsimonious cognitive structure. And so what the dyad allows you to do is to keep purity and to keep sanctity, even if you don't keep foundations. So thank you very much.